Welcome everybody to the British Foreign Policy Group. It's a pleasure to be here with you all virtually on this unusually warm September day. We are here to talk about one of the big issues that will be absolutely consuming all sorts of attention in Westminster over the coming months, which is obviously the US elections. These elections are always of global significance. They're always keenly watched in Westminster, but there is something about this one that really does feel particularly generational in its significance. And so the interest in the outcome seems keener than ever. It's also very timely that we're having this discussion because, of course, our Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab, is in Washington, D.C. as we speak, trying to smooth things over and keep that special relationship intact as we head into the election period and as Britain, of course, tries to keep things moving on a US trade deal. I think what's so interesting about this election is it's coming just at a time when we will be publishing the integrated review of foreign defense, security and development policy, which is really the starting point for the launch of the Global Britain Project, which we've all been hearing about so much. And there is word that this review has been pushed back a few weeks, potentially just after the election. And in many ways that does make sense because there is a very strong feeling in Whitehall that the outcomes of the election might be quite significant in terms of not only America's trajectory, but the future of the Western Alliance and certainly the way in which Britain will be relating to the United States as a global partner. So I'm very, very pleased that we are convening tonight here a bunch of people who I'm very privileged to know well and have in my life, but they're also some of the absolute brightest minds, all based here in the UK, but incredibly steeped in American politics. So we'll be trying to wade through some of these issues about what will be taking place domestically in the elections. We'll be looking at the foreign policy dimensions of all of this and what this means for the future of the special relationship. So joining me tonight, we have Sarah Elliot. She's the chair of Republicans Overseas UK, previously the managing director of the American European Business Association, and a Republican commentator and campaigner in both London and DC. Welcome, Sarah. We have Kate Andrews, the Spectator's economics correspondent and a former staffer on the Romney for President and Linda McMahon for Senate campaigns. Welcome, Kate.
Hi, Sophie.
We have Joseph Sternberg, a member of the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal, where he writes the political economics column. He's the author of The Theft of a Decade, How the Baby Boomers Stole the Millennials' Economic Future. Welcome, Joe. And we have Matthew McGrath. He's the managing director of Emissary Holdings, previously an advisor to the Albright Stonebridge Group in DC and a former staffer to Vice President Joe Biden. Welcome, Matt. And we have Nicky Woolf, who's a journalist who writes about American and British politics, technology, and social issues. And he was previously the launch editor of The New Statesman America. Welcome, Nicky.
Hi.
So tonight, we're going to have a bit of a discussion between us and in the panel, and then we are going to open things up to Q&A. You should all have a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Please, throughout the discussion, whenever the impulse comes to you, submit your questions, and then we'll try and get to as many of them as possible later in the discussion. Don't use the chat function, just the Q&A function if you can. And without further ado, I will turn to our wonderful panelists to answer this opening gambit. With polling day now only a matter of weeks away, really, what is the one single issue aside from the pandemic itself that you will feel will be most instrumental in deciding the outcome of the election? And could that have been predicted a year ago? And we'll start with Sarah.
Thank you, Sophie. Well, I think the one big thing which could have been predicted a year ago that will impact election day is the economy. And how well are we bouncing back from this COVID pandemic where our economy was put on hold? Is America getting back to work? People are seeing some sense of financial security? Are they feeling optimistic about 2021? Are they, seeing the crazy year that 2020 was receding behind them? It's consumer confidence. And it's also going to, who they choose will not just be, I think, someone who feels their pain, but who will be the best person to actually keep economic gains going. So if we don't have another setback, another COVID setback, or a huge natural disaster, I think the president is on good footing. We have added 10.6 million new jobs since the pandemic, and the unemployment rate continues to drop, and it's at 8.4% right now. So I think it's, as the famous Democratic President Bill Clinton said, it's the economy, stupid. And I think that's what will be at the forefront of America's minds, other than COVID, is when are we getting back to work? When are we getting back to normal? And can we get that roaring economy back again?
Thanks, Sarah. Let's go to Matthew next.
Well, thank you, Soph, and nice to see you again, Sarah. On our last session in February, for those of you who didn't join us in person in Mayfair, Sarah started off with some punchy remarks about Joe Biden, and at that time, the other alternative primary candidates. So now we've got Joe Biden, so Donald Trump is running against a singular person. And what is perhaps remarkable for the history of US presidential elections is that aside from coronavirus, the singular issue that probably will determine this outcome of this election is voter suppression. So it is a precedent of US politics. You can read in Theodore White's book on the 1960 election. You can look to the most recent Georgia governor's race. On the margins, it's a part of the sport of American politics to both drive your turnout, and then on the margins, you have some funny business. The difference with this president is that just as he fights elections as unpopularity contests versus popularity contests, he's fighting this election as a voter suppression exercise as opposed to a voter turnout exercise. The reason for that is that he simply can't run on his record. So Sarah cites the 10 plus million jobs created since the coronavirus crisis. Yeah, of course, but we're also at 8.5% unemployment, and we've lost 190,000 lives in the US. The United States has 4% of global population, and yet we have 23% of reported coronavirus deaths. So he can't run on his record. Therefore, what he can do are two things. He can run on suppression. He can limit polling places with allied governors. He can scare people. He can foment violence in urban areas. He can call out the militias. And then there are some moonshots he'll try, like trying to steamroll the FDA into releasing a COVID vaccine prior to full phase 3 and 4 trials. So the key issue, Soph, is that in this go around, unfortunately, the key issue is going to be the right to vote and voter suppression.
Thanks, Matthew. I can see this is going to be a fiery discussion. I'm thrilled. Joseph, what do you think is going to be the big issues shaping the election?
I have to agree with Sarah that it's going to be the economy, because it's always the economy in American elections. I think that it is very difficult in the US to have an election that is about anything other than the economy. And I think particularly this year, people, especially so long as the sense of acute crisis surrounding the virus starts to dissipate a little bit, if we don't see any additional waves beyond what we've already had, I think the focus really is going to become this question of who can get the American economy, who can get America back to work again as quickly as possible. And I think that really is going to be the dominant issue, because that is just the thing that people are the most worried about right now. I think that the amount of uncertainty that there is around this issue of people's livelihoods in the wake of the pandemic and all of the lockdowns, then having the second wave in some places that prompted new lockdowns when people had thought that we were out of those woods. I think that kind of issue is going to be the big issue. Now, challenge is that Trump is going to really struggle to talk about that. So I think that it's going to be an issue of whether either of the candidates is able to really speak to that concern that voters have. But I do think that that is going to be the main thing that will be front and center in voters' minds as they try to make a decision.
Okay. So 2 for the economy, 1 on voter turnout, and I suppose the flip side of that, which is potential voter suppression. Nicky.
So this is sort of a cheap answer, but I think the issue that's going to really change what happens in November is going to be social media, and it slightly plays into what everyone has said so far. But because it's the ecosystem by which voters are getting their information, if there is misinformation on social media that can convince Trump voters that the economy is great, they'll believe that. If there's misinformation that convinces, for example, voters of color in the South that, and they tried this in the previous election, that polling, for example, is on a different day, that kind of misinformation can have a huge effect. And that's sort of, to a certain extent, how voter suppression will happen. I think Matt's absolutely right. That's going to be a huge issue. But we're seeing things like QAnon having huge rallies, being a huge driver of support for this president. And I think that the social media companies like Twitter and Facebook have said that they're making moves to suppress disinformation, especially around COVID, but really haven't done anything meaningful to stop this flood.
Thanks, Nicky. This is interesting that we've got kind of 2 perspectives pushing for the economy as the key issue, and 2, I suppose, more focused on the structural framework in which the election itself is taking place. Kate.
Well, I suppose I'll be the one to tip the balance in favor of the economy. But Sarah and Joseph have done such a great job of covering that basis. I'll go for something slightly different, but perhaps related. I looked on Gallup to see what voters were saying was the most important issue to them, and coronavirus was obviously at the top of the list, but Sophie, you've ruled that out. And I found it interesting, but not terribly surprising, that the second most important topic was the government itself and poor leadership. And it's not surprising because Donald Trump was trying to frame this election leading up to the coronavirus crisis in terms of a referendum on himself. He wanted to talk about himself. He's good at talking about himself. He enjoys talking about himself. And he had an economy at the time that was a lot to boast about. I think there are many areas of criticism that we could point to as well, but he was going to try to frame this in terms of the economy. And to Sarah and Joseph's points, I think that would have had a lot of a strong effect anyway on those independent-minded people who thought, well, I don't love how he talks, I don't love what he says, but at least I know that my family and I are financially stable and comfortable right now. But having framed it in that way, the president now has a very serious problem on his hands, that the handling of the coronavirus crisis has been abysmal, especially when you compare it to other countries. The economy is bouncing back, but that credit obviously goes to the American public from a very grassroots level who decided that they were going to make it bounce back. If anything, the president's interventions, his comments about medicine, about the science of coronavirus, about masks and all of it has proven so volatile that one could really ask, even if Joe Biden and Kamala Harris were to put more restrictions back on the economy in other ways, could you see it recover faster in 2 to 3 years' time, because there will at least be more stability. So I think that's going to be a challenge for the president, although I completely agree with Joseph's comments that this election will also be framed as to who can get the economy back on track. And again, Donald Trump at least has a record there where he has quite a lot that he can say. So I think it's a real toss-up between how people view this government, how people view its ability to lead, its ability to communicate, and also the economic benefits that they've seen, well, the economic horror that they've seen the past 6 months, but the benefits that they saw 3.5 years prior. And I guess the last thing I would just say is that reflection on government and poor leadership isn't just at the top. At the end of the day, the president is in charge of the country. He is responsible. That is not to exempt him from responsibility. But I think a lot of voters will be going to the polls not just thinking about the president, but about how their local representatives handle coronavirus. In many ways in the States, it was a devolved issue states got to make different decisions at different times and have fared differently throughout that process. But especially in the wake of the protests and some of the looting and rioting that has happened, as a small fraction of those who are protesting, but has become a very significant issue in America, there will be many frustrations with local government as well as the federal government. So it's not obvious that everybody who says that that is an issue for them is necessarily against the president. I suspect the majority are, but you could certainly see some also frustrated with more liberal representatives on the local level as well. Over to you, Sophie.
So I think what's so interesting is just, I mean, in many ways, the pandemic has been completely seismic in terms of shifting the landscape of this election. I mean, from the issues right down to the practical elements of how this election will take place, you know, how people will vote and engage with it, the information they'll receive. You can see how there are sort of, it's been a negative force for Trump. It's also been a negative force potentially in some ways for the Democrats as well, because it's taken some of the other issues off the table. Then on the flip side, you know, it's helped Trump in a way, because when you have a pandemic, it kind of bolsters the incumbent, and, you know, when people are afraid, when there's a huge seismic event. But then also, you know, it's helped the Democrats because, of course, you know, Joe Biden hasn't had to be out on the campaign trail as much as he might have been. So it's kind of a mixed bag, really, in terms of how it's really affected both parties. And it's quite difficult even to predict, for example, the preponderance of mail-in voting and how that might shape the outcome. But are there any issues that you feel would have been really important in this election that perhaps have been somewhat diminished? Something that does come to mind if we were thinking about the conversation that we had at the start of the year perhaps is immigration. Have any issues been kind of neutralized or taken off the table in a way that might have been quite decisive in this election if the pandemic hadn't happened? Sorry, Joseph, why don't we start with you?
No, I think that immigration is the main one, and I also think that there are a couple elements of economic policy that probably would have been, you know, bigger talking points, but will not be. You know, for example, the whole trade issue. You know, I think that you can imagine an alternative universe where maybe foreign policy might have been more of an issue, where Biden would have wanted to focus on that as a way to draw some contrasts with Trump in terms of governing competence. You know, for example, and that would have been natural terrain for you know, Biden, given his long track record of, you know, dealing with foreign policy issues. And I think that you know, it's again in America, because elections do tend to come down to the economy, it's always a tough sell. You know, to try to have an election about something like foreign policy. And I think it's just not going to happen now, because we will be so focused on the economy.
Matthew.
If I could give two abbreviated answers to that question, I think Joseph's point is a great one. It's not the sexiest of campaign issues, but education really is perhaps the only solution to the long-term mismatches between the new jobs that are being created in the United States, innovation hubs in large cities, and the people who have been displaced in post-industrial, Rust Belt, Midwestern, Southern, rural areas. So education has been displaced if it ever would have been included, which I hope it would have been. The second issue I would raise is that COVID and the chaos arising from COVID has actually masked a pretty substantial track record of what you might call corruption in this current government. And I recognize I probably sound shrill talking about voter suppression and corruption, but I do think that on balance, that's where we are. I spend my days working with institutional investors on global risk and disputes issues, investor networks. In investor networks, messages travel very quickly, and scuttlebutt travels very quickly. And you wouldn't believe the number of instances you hear from asset managers, from venture capitalists, from infrastructure firms, real estate firms, just how much the Trump family is out there trading on access, and how much their friends and supporters and donors are doing the same. Not that that hasn't been systemic to US politics for decades, but it's of a new ilk. And there are many, let's call it confusion of public asset versus private asset questions that are not being asked because coronavirus is front and center.
Nicky.
Unmute myself. I think the huge issue that would have taken up a lot of this year, if it wasn't for coronavirus, is race and police violence. We've seen some of the most horrifying events, some of the most horrifying shootings, enormous protests. And the thing that really stuck with me was that video when a white supremacist arrived at a protest, literally shot several of the protesters, and the police handed him water. In a normal year, that's bonkers. And it was, you know, even for America, which does not have a sterling track record on this sort of thing, this has been a crazy year. And that, I think, would have been a huge issue. And I think in a lot of communities still will be, and will move a lot of voters and send a lot of people to the polls. But I think that would have been really what the airtime was going to be if it wasn't for the virus.
I mean, one could argue that the Black Lives Matter protests, and I mean, it feels like in some ways that was a kind of steam valve of something that had been brewing for a long time, but it also doesn't seem coincidental that those protests have really catalyzed during the coronavirus pandemic because of the inequalities which were revealed by the pandemic. So it sort of created a structural frame for that to open up, and probably the partisanship of and tribalism of an election year may have facilitated some of the force of feeling around that as well. Sarah.
I would just say that I think healthcare would have posed a bigger issue this election cycle if it wasn't for COVID, and in a way, because it is a health crisis, it does present itself. But, you know, that's a constant issue for all Americans, the healthcare issue. And of course, the Trump administration has stripped out the really ugly pieces of Obamacare, such as the individual mandate. And he has committed to keeping everyone with a pre-existing condition in the insurance programs. So, but there's still a lot of debate on how to make it affordable. And the efforts that the president has made to make it affordable, like right to try or keeping prices low. He just passed a recent executive order for that in the pharmaceutical industry. You know, that's just going to be masked, but that is a daily struggle for all Americans. It doesn't matter what side of the aisle you are on. Ever since healthcare is very expensive in America and has increasingly become so over the last 10 years.
And Kate.
I'm not terribly convinced that the way that debate plays out would be all that different with or without COVID. The topics would be substantially different, a world away from what we ever could have imagined 9 months ago. But the election was always going to be about whether or not you liked the president. Everything was going to be framed in that way. Whoever the candidate was going to be, Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders, anybody, was going to be the anti-Trump candidate, and that is at the end of the day where the sides were going to fall. So I don't think that has changed. In terms of the actual topics that we're discussing, I think climate change would have probably been at the forefront of the Democrats' manifesto and campaigning, and I think that would have been relatively successful for them as more and more Americans are aware of the issue and rank it towards the top of their list in terms of important priorities. But I also think foreign policy would have played a role, specifically the track record of the candidates. And I think there Donald Trump would have actually done reasonably well. Not simply would the Abraham Accords have gotten so much more media attention abroad, I'm thinking of as well. Here in the UK, it has been reported on, of course, but not nearly to the extent that it would have been if the news agenda were slower. It really is actually quite a monumental moment. But, you know, Trump is not completely honest about his track record on the Iraq War by any means, but you do have a candidate in Joe Biden who historically has been quite heavy-handed on foreign policy, follows in the Hillary Clinton trajectory, really, of somebody who's quite interventionist. And Donald Trump can at least point to a presidency in which he's taken a very different tactic. And given the country at the moment just has absolutely no appetite for that kind of intervention, I think it probably would have weighed in the president's favor.
So that's a perfect segue for us to get stuck into the foreign policy question here. So this is the one that I think is being asked the most. And of course, here in Britain, we are rather sort of myopically focused on. What does a Biden administration look like on foreign policy? And what does 4 more years of Trump look like on foreign policy? And what kind of, where's the divergence between them? How demonstrative would that change be? Because I think something that has sort of become clearer, I think, to people in Westminster is, you know, with the benefit of passing years, is to realize as well that, you know, while Trump has obviously been a kind of step change in things, in tone, you know, there's been a lot of demonstrative acts, you know, pulling America out of this and that, and it has been a disruptive and more unpredictable kind of foreign policy. But there has been a much broader trajectory which predated Trump's presidency, which, you know, in which America has started to take a much more distinct role in its foreign policy outside of being the centrifugal force of the Western alliance. So where do we think a Biden presidency might go on these things? How significant would that change be? And what does 4 more years of Trump look like? Is it similar to the 4 years that we've had? Are there many more international agreements? Are they just going to sort of drop like dominoes one by one? Or will a more kind of cohesive approach and sort of strategic vision start to emerge from all of this? Matthew.
Okay, well, I'd lay out 5 points actually as it relates to consultants, of course. 5 points as it relates to things to look for in a Biden administration on foreign policy. One is that a Biden foreign policy set of appointees will look pretty similar, most likely, to the Obama administration. So you'll see a number of familiar faces. Tony Blinken, who's outstanding, is playing a leading role. He's the former Deputy Secretary of State and former Deputy National Security Advisor. One of Biden's longtime right hands, Brian McKeon, he was a Senate aide for 24 years, will be in the mix, and he was in the Pentagon with Obama. You'll see Avril Haines, former Deputy Director of the CIA, John Feiner, Susie George, people who are quite experienced, as well as potentially you would look for folks like John Kerry, who might step into special envoy roles, recognizing the amount of work that needs to be done to repair alliances and make a dent on global issues that require coordination. Second, obviously, coronavirus will dominate. So the first foreign policy priority will be to help to control the environment at home through coordination on travel and on vaccine distribution, so as not to create the kind of competition and bidding up of vaccines, vaccine nationalism that we saw at home on ventilators early on, which was horrible. Number 3, we'll see what Biden has for years talked about, which is that the best example of our power is the power of our example. And he said that for years. And he is a true believer that the best way for us to project our influence in terms of our values and our interests abroad is to have our house in order. And so you'll see an integration and a recognition that how we conduct ourselves at home, not only in our discourse, but in our rule of law, in our democratic practices, will reflect abroad. And we need to make sure that we have our house in order before we tell others how to keep theirs. The 4th point would be on rebuilding alliances. And I think it's really a key point as it relates to the UK, because for really since the Second World War, perhaps earlier than that, the key role for the UK, at least in the eyes of Washington, D.C., has been the first partner for coordination on global matters, whether it's climate change or engagement at the WTO or WHO in the instance of coronavirus. So there will be a focus on replenishing what we might call in other relationships, the social capital, the relationship capital that has been diminished in our traditionally strong alliances in Western Europe, some in East Asia as well. And 5th and finally, there will be a renewed focus on global issues. So you've basically seen that the Trump administration has had no interest in addressing issues of global commons, whether it's oceans or climate change or nuclear nonproliferation through a partnership strategy. And so there will be a lot of putting genies back in the bottles, historic conflicts and tensions that are arising in the Eastern Mediterranean and Himalayas, There may be some surprises that we see between now and Election Day in the South China Sea, maybe around Taiwan. And so those would be the 5 points that might define a Biden foreign policy.
Thanks, Matt. And we're having some issues with your microphone, so maybe we can do a quick unplug, replug, I don't know. That's all I know about technology. Just plug it, pull it out, restart. I don't know. Let's try that because it's just fading in a little bit. And you're making excellent points, but I think we got all of that. So essentially, what you're saying is there will be quite a lot of continuity with the Obama administration, but also quite a significant shift from the Trump era. It will partly be about restoring, but also you would anticipate going beyond and trying to kind of look forward and reinstate America's position as a kind of global leader for good. Brilliant. Let's go to Sarah.
Yeah, what was amazing to me about those remarks is that it didn't mention at all China and how Biden would take on now the biggest opponent to America, and I would say Western democracies in general. We are now in a new Cold War era. I think COVID has pretty much solidified that. The President Trump, made it an election issue in 2016. He's obviously lived up to his rhetoric by being tough on China with tariffs, et cetera, changing our trading relationship with China, especially in regards to technology transfer and IP. And I want to know, what Joe Biden would confront China with, because he sat on the Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate while we were shipping all of our jobs and manufacturing over to China, while he was saying, even as of May of last year, that China is no competition for us and they're not bad guys, folks. And I want to know if he would still stand by those words, if he would continue to use tariffs against China, if he would continue to militarize or keep the military strong in the South China Sea, as Donald Trump has been doing. Will he continue? Will he push for better trade relations and commit to saying, yes, we were right to give China preferred trading nation status. We were right to put China on the WTO, which has led to its ascension as a super world power. I want to know if he still thinks that what is good for China is good for the rest of the world and good for Americans. So I think he has a lot to answer for on his record on China. And what would he have done differently in a COVID crisis, by the way? Because when President Trump was closing down the borders to China, Biden was calling Trump xenophobic. Nancy Pelosi was saying everyone should go to Chinatown, everyone should still be doing large gatherings. That's as of March. So I'd like to know what he would have done differently. And how he would stand up to China, especially when he's been quite cozy. You also have to look at his son, Hunter Biden, who received $1 billion worth of investment from the Bank of China shortly thereafter, a state visit or a diplomatic visit by the vice president. I mean, it's all quite, he's been quite cozy with Xi Jinping. And so I'm not confident that he's the man to stay tough on China as we move forward. In terms of a Trump foreign policy, I think you're going to see more of the same. I think you're going to see not an inclination to get engaged into military conflicts. You're going to see more normalization between Israel and other neighbors, such as Oman and perhaps even Saudi Arabia. You're going to see a US-UK free trade deal. That is, if the UK wants it. The US is extending its hand, and I wish it the best success. You'll see more one-on-one trade deals and less omnibus big trade negotiations like TTIP. And you'll see a very strong Anglo-American relationship, which is very good for a post-Brexit Britain. But I think in a Biden administration, you go back to a globalist agenda and you go back to big multinational organizations. The other thing that Trump could throw in a second term is actually withdrawing from the UN altogether if he doesn't think it's in America's best interest, and actually forming a new alliance, global alliance with the democracies, with the D10. And that would completely change international politics. But I will say, in defense of the president, it might be America first, but it is not America alone. And you can see that by his commitment to NATO and the increased spending he has, but through his pressure and relationships, has increased for NATO. Over $130 million. And over the course of the next 4 years, I think it's going to exceed over 300 million. So it's not America alone, but it is looking out for the American taxpayer.
I think that's a really interesting perspective because, of course, a lot of the discussion about Trump's relationship with NATO here is through the prism of the ongoing tensions between the United States and the European Union, particularly Germany, around its spending on NATO. And we've obviously had it just over the summer, we've had the withdrawal of a significant number of US troops from Germany who have been historically there since the Second World War. And so there's a lot of, I suppose that the European perspective on this is that Trump is threatening the future of NATO. It's interesting to hear the other perspective saying that actually he is pushing for reform to invest in its future. Nicky.
A lot to unpack there. I'll start off by saying how amazing it is to see the Republicans, nominally the party of free trade and libertarian economics, becoming the party of economic protectionism in the name of, quote unquote, bringing jobs back. A lot of these free trade agreements were the Reaganite project, right? And it's fascinating to watch this Republican government unpick those because they've seen a different way the political winds are blowing. But I think ultimately, when it comes to, and to narrow the focus down to the prospects for the UK in terms of getting this free trade deal, putting aside the fact that we don't know what America's terms are going to be for any of these deals, whether milk has been the example that keeps coming up, but it's the safety regulations on milk are very different in the United States and the United Kingdom. Specifically, I think there's 70% less pus in European milk because of the European. When we talk about regulations, that's the kind of thing we mean. It's saying, less hair in your steak by regulation. And if that has to go by the board in order to get a free trade deal with the United States, that is the price the United Kingdom is just going to have to pay. We're not in a strong negotiating position here because we put all of our eggs into this single basket. But ultimately, as far as I can see of the Trump administration, it's basically a random number generator. Like, I think if there's one thing that puts the UK in a good position in terms of negotiation, it's that we've got a Trump golf course here that he really likes. And it genuinely might come down to that. And we've seen that play out in policy earlier this year dramatically when the UK wasn't put under the same COVID restrictions at the beginning as the rest of Europe. Explicitly because Trump wanted people to still be able to go to his golf course. And so I think that's the position we find ourselves in that Trump could wake up one day and if, for example, the British media publishes an unflattering story about him, he'll change his entire policy position on a dime because that's what this administration does.
So an unpredictable negotiating partner is Joseph.
I'm going to disagree with everyone here by arguing that in terms of a lot of these foreign policy issues, maybe it actually doesn't matter who wins the election, because I think that the thing that has tended to get lost because Trump himself is such a flamboyant and distracting character is the extent to which there is this slow-moving development of a consensus in Washington, Sophia, that you referred to right in the very beginning of this discussion. And I think that you see that across a range of issues. Trump is sort of representative of that on some of these points. And I think that's going to carry over into the next administration, no matter who's the president. So, on issues like the alliances, we talk a lot about, unhelpful things that Trump might be doing on NATO right now. And I, share a lot of the concern about the particular manifestations of that. But this, American discontent with the extent to which European partners are or are not carrying their own weight within the alliance predates Trump. In fact, it was under the Obama administration that you first started seeing new efforts to put pressure on European countries to increase their defense expenditure within NATO. So that's an instance where Trump has been particularly flamboyant, but he hasn't necessarily been very new. And you can just go down the list of these items. I mean, on things like China policy, I think that there is now a developing bipartisan consensus on a lot of these issues within Washington that is going to sort of both drive and also potentially constrain the next president, regardless of which person that is or which party he's from. I think that on a bunch of these issues, to do with rebuilding, international participation, and whether you're talking about the Iran nuclear deal, which is something where there was not a strong consensus in Washington in favor of it during the Obama administration, which is why it never went through the Senate. And there is not a consensus in favor of it now on issues like a lot of international cooperation on climate issues. There was not consensus on that issue in Washington before. There isn't now, and I don't think that there's going to be in the immediate future. So I think that the real theme, even on UK issues like a post-Brexit trade deal, we talk a lot about these food, health, and safety standards, but that has been a long-running, negotiating interest of the US in all sorts of trade deals, far predating the Trump administration. So I think that we shouldn't get so distracted by Trump and the crazy things that he does on a daily basis that we lose sight of this underlying consensus in Washington that is really going to be steering a lot of these issues over the next 4 years.
Kate.
Quickly on military conflicts, I don't think that, as I said before, there's any appetite for Joe Biden to show his hawkish side. And I don't think he would unprovoked. But I also don't think he'll have the appetite that Donald Trump seems to have had to try to reach out in other ways. And Trump takes gambles. It's very difficult to see how a Joe Biden, certainly not a Barack Obama, would have gotten Kim Jong-un to sit down at the table as Trump did. Now, we're probably not going to know for a decade if we've been made a mockery of or if that's going to make substantial change. But getting to the table and doing so without weapons is obviously the first step. In a less extreme scenario, I think even the Abraham Accords are a very good example of that as well. Trump takes these gambles that I'm not sure a Joe Biden would. And so far, they've more or less panned out for him. But these are very long-term projects and goals, and we're not going to know the results of them while Donald Trump's in office, regardless of whether or not he wins a second term. I think the trade point is very interesting because I'm inclined to think that Joe Biden will be better for getting a US-UK free trade deal for two reasons, really. The first is that he will see signing up to trade deals like that, potentially rejoining TTIP, as the antithesis of what Donald Trump would do. It is a response to Donald Trump as well. And I think that he will be quite inclined to show the rest of the world through trade that the US wants to negotiate again, that it wants to be allies again from a trade perspective. Of course, as well, we know that trade deals are very good for your own consumers back at home. They tend to lower prices. Interconnectivity has its real benefits, so there will be an economic boost to that as well. But I think the second reason Joe Biden will be better for a US-UK trade deal, actually, I'm not sure he meant to, but I think Nicky almost started pointing at this with his own comments, is that I think it's much easier to fearmonger around this kind of deal when Donald Trump is in office. And we saw that with the Labour Party leading up to the 2019 general election. We've seen that in lots of media outlets, people saying, oh, well, it'll be the Trump deal. We'll be lowering all of our standards. We'll be in the gutter with this trade deal. We're going to have to accept all kinds of poisonous foods and drinks and milk and the rest of it. And, we're just going to hand over our trade and our standards to Donald Trump. It's a much harder argument to make with Joe Biden thrown in. The Biden trade deal doesn't exactly have the same ring to it. It doesn't make people as nervous. And, I think to really believe that the chlorinated chicken that Americans eat is so dangerous, when actually there are plenty of studies that show that you're less likely to get food poisoning from it. I'm just not sure. I think those arguments will still get some traction, but they won't get the same traction when it's Joe Biden doing the negotiations as Donald Trump. So I'm inclined to think that Biden will actually be better for getting that deal for two quite different reasons.
Interesting. I mean, we've been doing quite a bit of social research around the UK's trade policy, and it's quite astonishing the degree to which values are seen as something that people want to be very central to our trading policy, and that agricultural standards, protections for farmers and animal welfare, which is all kind of linked into this one sort of agricultural area, seems to be the biggest sort of a potential tension point amongst the British public in terms of concerns about our future trading policy with America or with.
Can I just say really quickly, that's protectionism in a nutshell, and it's actually quite ironic that the US president right now is a protectionist. I mean, he does say America first. He does crack down on trade deals when he doesn't think America's getting its fair share of the deal. It's almost ironic, really, that you could bring in a president like Joe Biden, who's going to be much more small L liberal and open on trade deals. And it might be the UK that's taking the more protectionist position, given that that's how we've been characterizing the US in quite a bad way for the past 4 years.
Yes, well, I think in many ways, though Britain doesn't necessarily always see itself as such, in many ways it has become much closer to a European social democracy than a kind of Anglosphere, Thatcherite, Reaganite kind of vision. So there's been some really interesting Pew Research polling that's come out today, which very much chimes with research that we've been doing at BFPG throughout the pandemic on America's global image amongst its allies and partners. The story across the board is pretty dire. There's been a pretty sharp fall in America's reputation and perceptions of its kind of moral force in the world under the Trump presidency. That has declined quite significantly during the pandemic because America is widely regarded by the British people, the Germans, French, Japanese, and Australians, and so on, as having had a worse pandemic than even countries like China. So what do we think about the future of American soft power? Does this matter? Is it somehow a kind of correction, a growing pain after, as America goes through a shift from having been the world's police and moves to a sort of less interventionist policy? Should America be concerned about this? And what could be done to restore this, whether under a Trump or a next term or a Biden presidency? Sarah.
Well, I think as long as America has, if not the strongest economy in the world, or at least in the top two, our soft power will always be influential. And we also have the largest military and the best human killing machine the world has ever seen, which hopefully will lead to peace through strength, and we don't have to deploy it. But I think that our economy, our military, as long as they remain the strongest, we'll always have a seat at the table. We'll always be leading the conversation. But I think that, whenever you have a Republican in office, you always see America's approval ratings drop in terms of global affairs or how we're viewed in the world. So I think Americans, they care about how they're perceived, but they know that once there's a liberal, left-wing progressive in the White House, and everybody tends to love America a bit more, and we just kind of ride with the cycles. And again, we know that even if you don't like us, you have to respect us because of our economic and military power, and that's just the way it is. I think we're also leading the charge on keeping China accountable and changing the global relationship with China. And so we are paving the way for fairer, more transparent relations with them. And Europeans appreciate that we put our foot out first and that we are the leader in that way. And then they get to reap the benefits of a more transparent and cooperative China. So, you know, I think at least I speak for the Republicans on that point of view.
Interesting. I mean, yes, it's absolutely true that there was also a decline under Bush that was largely linked to the Iraq War, which was obviously hugely unpopular in Europe and the UK. But yes, and then it's an interesting sort of enormous boost under Obama and then another fall. But I don't think that's necessarily just about a liberal kind of conservative paradigm. I think there's something about America as kind of a force for good in the world. I think, well, although people perhaps America's an easy target because it's so prominent and visible, but I think in many ways people are rooting for America and would like America to be a kind of really prominent moral force. Nicky.
Can I just say one thing in response to that? Then I think then the world should actually be exhaling a sigh of relief right now, actually, because we've had some very historic peace deals that have been signed in the last month, 3, in fact, with more on the way. And we also haven't enveloped our allies in any kind of military engagement. We haven't participated in a new war. We haven't done preemptive strikes. We haven't, and again, we've boosted the war fund, the war chest of our allies of NATO. So I think that with Trump in office, it actually seems to be slightly quieter. You know, North Korea's not testing nuclear weapons at the moment. Iran's gone quiet at the moment, you know, so I don't know. I think from my perspective, the world is a quieter place because of this. And actually, if there is a Biden administration, he will benefit from it.
If I may, Soph.
Yeah.
Sorry, Nicky. Thanks, man. I'd rebut a few points you just laid out there to my friend on the right, which is North Korea right now is about to South Korea reports that North Korea is now testing, once again, submarine-launched nuclear weapons. We did launch a preemptive strike on Iran, and as a result, there are now reports that they've taken out a hit on our U.S. ambassador to South Africa. We look at China, which you spoke about before. The effective annexation or legal invasion of Hong Kong did not happen until the presidency of Donald Trump. And that will be a very, very hard thing to unwind. That now there is no longer really going to be two nations between two countries, two systems under one nation between Hong Kong and China. I've had the joy of attending the British Foreign Policy Group soft power sessions, and if there was a summary of some of the past events, basically, one of the themes is that the UK soft power comes from having designed international norms and systems, from cultural and educational projection, from soft ties in business and trade and investment. And those are all things that we as Americans should want for the US. As the world's largest economy, we want to predominate in those FDI links, those import-export links. That's how we maintain our alliances, and they're also pro-cyclical to creating new alliances. When Americans as people are looked upon as people who are not of strong moral character, or we're looked on as being irrational by others in the world, that actually diminishes the option to work with American firms in the mind of foreign firms. And so as an American and as an American entrepreneur in London, I think there is a strong interest in the private sector to have a very strong soft power projection from the United States, so as to boost our economic growth and our business growth. And lastly, I don't buy the argument that soft power is a function, or popularity is a function, of democratic or liberal administrations. You take a look at the first Gulf War. I mean, George H.W. Bush was basically commended for having run a textbook military and diplomatic campaign by our allies. And you look at what James Baker has been saying in the last year and 2 years, which is that the reason that America is great and the reason why we are powerful, among having, in addition to having the world's largest economy, is because we have more friends. We have more friendships, deeper friendships, more alliances. We've constructed those alliances and their architectures, and it would be a shame if we let that lapse.
Nicky.
Thanks. And I mean, congratulations are probably due on negotiating peace between Israel, Bahrain, and the UAE, three countries that visibly weren't at war to start with. But all that notwithstanding, I don't think the American reputation, I think, is globally diminished because America has nature's perfect idiot as its president. But I don't think American soft power in and of itself is actually really diminished. People are using American social networks. People are watching American movies still. People are watching American television. America's influence in the world in terms of its soft power remains robust, and I think is rescuable. If anything, it was diminishing as internet penetration becomes more Spanish language, becomes more Chinese language. But America was on the crest of the wave of the internet, and I think that gives it a very strong position in terms of soft power. And I think national reputation and national government reputation is separate from the kind of soft power that a country can wield. But I do think it feeds into it. And I think 4 more years of Trump, and I think we really would start to see, America's position on the global stage dissolving, because, and I would take issue with the idea that the global community judges a Republican president and not a Democrat president. We're not looking at party politics from Europe, and the rest of the world doesn't care whether a Democrat or a Republican's in the Oval Office. Reagan was hugely popular on the world stage. George H.W. Bush was hugely respected on the world stage. It was only after the Iraq War that Republicans started being judged more than their Democrat colleagues. And I think that was more down to individual personalities of the president and their policies than some kind of attachment to Democrat globalization policy.
Thanks, Nicky. Kate?
I'm inclined to agree that with Nicky that American soft power from the cultural perspective hasn't taken much of a hit. I think as long as America remains market-oriented, open, and willing to share its culture with the world, people will continue to consume it. It's very much enjoyed. I think that in order for America to retain its soft power, it has to get its house in order in the way that it treats its own citizens when it comes to law and order. And the protests that we have seen these past few months reflect decades worth of systematic problems in our system that mean that some people are not treated as equally as others and don't feel as safe as others when it comes to law enforcement, often because of the color of their skin. And my colleague here at The Spectator, Cindy Hughes, done some interesting reporting on how this has been used in places like China to essentially undermine any argument that the Chinese state oversteps. Just in these past few months related to the security law, and in my opinion, the absolute travesty that's taking place in Hong Kong right now, imposed by the Chinese state, a lot of the comments on it are undermined because when American voices involve themselves, they say, I can't breathe as the response. And you know what? That's actually quite a powerful response. And so America must get its house in order to deal with human rights abuses abroad, especially if we're not using our military power and we want to use our soft power. It must get its house in order. And I think, you can look to the UK, and one of the strongest responses we've seen on the security law has actually been from the Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab here, who has extended a pathway to citizenship for 3 million residents of Hong Kong who are eligible to have it. And that doesn't just come from a country with historic ties to the region that's able to do that, but also a country that certainly has its own issues, don't get me wrong, but doesn't have the same problem that America has right now with people of all different races and backgrounds taking real issue with the way that law enforcement has been able to operate for a long time now. And that's not really party political. For every Republican that has an issue with this, you'll find a Democrat as well. I'm actually quite loath to give a lot of credit to this current president, but I have liked some of the criminal justice reform that he's brought in. We need so much more of that, and I don't really care who does it as long as someone does it.
Thanks, Kate. And I think that point around needing to be able to speak with an authentic and legitimate voice on the world stage seems to have become much more top of mind in discussions about the projection of national values, and obviously something we have been talking about rather a lot here in Westminster over the past week around our our forthright support on the world stage for the defense and advancement of international law. Joseph.
Well, so I mean, look, I think that it is true that, I mean, my sense, having lived outside of the US for nearly 15 years now, you know, part of that time in Asia, part of that time here in the UK, I mean, I do think that there's this difference between the pull that the idea of America has on people outside of the US versus the, you know, pull or otherwise the fact of America at any given moment might have on people. And I think that that idea is certainly still very powerful, that cultural influence, you know, that America is able to project around the world, and, you know, sort of the way that you know, does seem to, for lack of a better phrase, but, you know, pluck at the heartstrings of people in various interesting ways, you know, at different times around the world. But, you know, I would push back a little bit on this notion that the fact of America is creating as much of a soft power problem, because, I mean, with respect to Kate, for example, I mean, I think this point about how things like, you know, America's serious law enforcement problems are presented by the Chinese state media, I mean, that is sort of an issue. But at the end of the day, the Chinese people know which country they would rather be living in terms of the respect that they can expect to get from their government and the police. And that's why, you know, for example, part of the leverage that America has diplomatically with China is the ability to you know, deprive Chinese elites of the ability to send their children to American schools. So I think that, you know, that pull, despite all of the very, you know, troubling, terrible images that we see on the nightly news out of America right now, I think that that fact is, you know, that is still very strong. And I think that I don't see that going away, you know, immediately. And you also see that sort of thing in Hong Kong, which has come up a couple of times here, where I think that the protesters certainly know which side they would rather be on if it were between the US and Beijing. And, you know, I think that we should take that kind of signal seriously if you're, you know, attempting any kind of assessment of where American soft power stands right now.
Sophie, if I can just clarify very quickly, I completely agree, Joseph. I think that it's in no way a direct comparison, but more a point that if you're going to actively stick up for certain kinds of rights, if you're going to actively interject yourself into the debate, then you have to make sure that you're on good footing. And I would argue that, well, there's absolutely no doubt between the US and China, which one has a much deeper and more fundamental respect for these things, that the US could do a lot more to show its own commitment to human rights at home as it comments on what's happening abroad.
Well, and I would just add to that I think that a big part of American soft power on this sort of issue is that people abroad see that Americans have that kind of conversation with ourselves. And I think that one, you know, fact about America that is important when you're looking at things like the protests over police violence is the fact that the protests are happening, that this is a matter of open discussion and debate within America, that you know, ordinary citizens are able to put substantial pressure on the government to try to reform itself by appealing to American constitutional principles and our history on these matters. And I think that that kind of dynamic is also a very important part of America's soft power, even when people see all of the obvious and serious dysfunctions that we suffer. They also see how American society and American politics responds to that kind of pressure.
Thank you so much. It's incredibly fascinating. And there's actually quite a few other foreign policy issues which I'd like to touch on before we close on this little discussion. The one topic I really want to just probe is the question of Russia. Now, this is something that, again, I think has been one of those strange kind of phenomena that is very unique to the Trump presidency and this particular time that we find ourselves in. Historically, one would have thought that the Republican Party might have taken perceived interferences in American democracy and election security via Russia as something to be deeply concerned about. It seems very unfortunately to have moved into quite a partisan arena. This is something rather familiar to us, unfortunately, as well in Westminster, because we've seen the same phenomenon both on the left and the right. It's not unique to any party. So I'm really interested in where you think the conversation on Russia is going to go. We've obviously had a lot of allegations have been coming out of the National Intelligence Committee. We've seen all sorts of kind of whistleblowers and leaked messages and recordings and so on about this topic and about this sense that fundamentally this president does not want to acknowledge that there is a risk or a weakness towards Russian interference, and that somehow this has fallen into a dangerously partisan space. I'm interested in the views of our panelists on this question. Do you believe that there truly is a partisan slant to the way in which a national security issue is now being addressed? And how can you imagine that this will evolve under another term of Trump or under a Biden presidency? Matt, let's kick off with you.
Gosh, it's a very large question, so I'll try to address part of it. It's notable and unique in post-war United States history that the former Republican presidents or the former presidents of a party would not support openly and vocally their candidate or their incumbent candidate for the presidency. And that's what we've seen. And there's been a fundamental lack of respect for how he's treated the office. And this has been part and parcel of that loss of respect, the loss of standing amongst his peers of former presidents. There are many interwoven issues in how Russia manifests for the Trump presidency, everything from Ukraine to Deutsche Bank and the financing of Trump's own business, and the list goes on. But it is notable that he has conflated Russian, let's call it Russian affairs, personal and government, with the affairs of domestic affairs at home, and how he's winning his elections and how he is opting to run the country. And it's just simply notable that there's the conventional Republican wing, the moderate wing, you might call it, of past presidents and their staffers and supporters who are not necessarily on board, and that is a large reason.
Yes, I suppose it will not have escaped anybody's knowledge here that it is quite extraordinary that the former Republican candidate, of course, Mitt Romney, for president, actually voted for the impeachment of the current president. So we are in extraordinary times. Joseph.
Well, I mean, I would just say that this, Russia is another example of this long-term developing consensus in Washington that I was talking about earlier in our conversation. And I mean, I think that it is symptomatic of that a Democratic Party supporting member of this panel is now taking such a hard line on Russia when the Obama administration brought us that preposterous red reset button that Hillary took off to a meeting with Lavrov, and he was lampooning Mitt Romney for complaining about Russia policy during a debate. So I think that what has happened, if nothing else, is that I think that American politics is waking up to the fact that there is a Russian problem. I think that Trump does not do himself any favors by insisting on personalizing this. I think that a lot of his resistance to the obvious fact that there is Russian attempts at meddling in the election is the sense that you then try to take that fact to delegitimize his victory. And it would be helpful if he could kind of separate out those issues instead of having to personalize everything, but we are where we are. And I think meanwhile, you have signs that the Trump administration has been somewhat more successfully aggressive against Russia. For example, I think that some of the success starting to push back against the Nord Stream 2 pipeline is symptomatic of that. I think that if you separate out a lot of the really unhelpful and very confusing rhetoric that you get from Trump on a daily basis, and you look at what has actually happened, what you are seeing is sort of a reasonably hawkish approach to Russia over the past 4 years. And the fact that that now represents this bipartisan consensus in Washington that Russia is a problem that America needs to think about managing again, suggests that that kind of trend is going to continue regardless of who ends up winning in a couple months.
Interesting. So I suppose the argument again that it's more about it's there's more involved here than the man in the White House. This is about the system itself more broadly, the State Department, Congress, and so on, actually continuing to fundamentally enact a degree of consistency with foreign policy despite the let's say unpredictable interventions of the president itself, and as you say, the personalization that he's brought to this issue. I think we should probably also note the very strange circumstances of his own personal relations, financial and otherwise, with Russia as well. Nicky.
Well, I was going to offer a kind of essentially counter argument to what I've been saying before, which is that it speaks very highly, I think, on this particular issue of the American system, that no matter what eventually happened with it in the Senate, there was a full and comprehensive investigation of Russian interference by the US government, which is a process that the UK has not been able to go through in a similar manner when all the evidence points to the fact that Russia was engaging in exactly the same operations with the Brexit referendum that they were in the US. And at least the US has looked into those things, whether it made a huge kind of impact. We forget that the impeachment vote was this January, right? This is how much time seems to have passed since then. It feels like 10 years ago. But there was a real soul-searching moment there. That I think is something that the UK must at some point go through.
I think that's a really interesting point, and we do like to think somehow that our institutions in Britain have stood up more strongly. I think it's fair to say, and I think we're going to have a whole other event just on this, just looking specifically at the future of the State Department, which has been through a bit of turmoil over the past 4 years, and where that might go. But I think that it is right to point to the fact that in some ways the American system has held up perhaps more robustly, and I suppose they do have written constitution, which is something that we will probably never have. Kate.
Yeah, Joseph alluded to it, but I can't help but take this moment to note that Mitt Romney in that third presidential debate did say that Russia would be the biggest geopolitical foe, and Barack Obama said the 1980s are calling and want the foreign policy back. Clearly that hasn't proven exactly true. Russia feels emboldened to poison its political foes on its own soil and on international soil here in the UK as well. It's wildly out of hand. And at some point this will have to be reckoned with. But I suppose to conclude, there's an interesting race that has to take place before we actually get to these arguably, much more long-term substantial questions. And that is the race for the COVID vaccine. And I think if you want to just combine a few of the things we've been talking about, if you want to see how soft player is playing out, if you want to see how the relationships between the West and Russia and China are playing out, look at the race for this vaccine, which I think is one of the most fascinating things to look to during coronavirus. Russia claims to have it. We're skeptical. We think that a lot of that may well be coming from the Oxford trials that were hacked, that are being administered without properly going through phase 3. But this is really quite an interesting moment in which whoever gets the first credible vaccine is going to get so much international clout, regardless of who they are or what their track record is. It could potentially be game-changing. And there is a real concern that a country that does not respect or uphold human rights in the way that the UK or the USA does could get this vaccine, and how that completely rewrites the history, not just of coronavirus, where it came from, how it spread, who lied, who had the biggest death toll, who had the biggest economic contraction, but really how these relationships are formed on the bigger questions that we're discussing going into the future. So, I mean, that's the race that I'm watching, because I think the way that we handle Russia and China is actually going to be very different if and when we find a vaccine, and who finds it and how quickly.
A very important point. One of the most fascinating geopolitical dimensions of the coronavirus pandemic has, of course, been this sort of burgeoning vaccine and equipment, I suppose, PPE nationalism, the discussions about onshoring supply chains and so on. And that's all to play for over the next 6 months as everyone races to release their citizens and their economies from the chains of this pandemic. Let's just quickly touch again. We've talked about China, but let's just hit this head on, because this is Russia obviously will continue to be an enormous, casting a specter across Western politics, but we know that China, and particularly in the US elections, China is going to be the kind of central paradigm to thinking about foreign policy and America's role in the world and its economic policy as well. Where do we think things are going? I mean, it seems to me that the conversation has moved to quite a heated place where it's actually rather difficult to maneuver from here. The options moving forward are difficult. Sarah mentioned a new Cold War. What does that war look like? Is this a military war? And what about the American involvement? America has a sort of arbitration process of oversight in the Hong Kong declaration as well. We've seen a few motions pass through Congress on this, as has been mentioned. Dominic Raab here, the Foreign Secretary, came out very strongly against Hong Kong. Britain, of course, has its own special relationship there. So where do we think the situation with China is likely to go over the next couple of years? Are we looking at a military war when we talk about a Cold War? And is there any way of bringing Hong Kong back from the brink? We'll start with Joseph, because you have lived and worked out there in Hong Kong for some time. So very interested to hear your perspectives.
Well, I mean, I think that the long-term thing to understand about all of this is, again, a lot of this predates Trump, including events in Hong Kong, because, I mean, I left the territory in 2014 to move to the UK, so 2 years before Trump was elected, and already you had the umbrella protest movement against their, protest movement there against some of Xi Jinping's early attempts to clamp down on the territory. I mean, I think that the way to understand this is that for a long time, the bipartisan agreement in Washington was that we would extend an open hand to China economically, and then we would hope that the politics there would catch up with the economic development. And so I think that the theory was that economic growth would inevitably lead to democratization. What has changed is that Xi Jinping seems to be very concerned that that might in fact happen. So you have had this tendency to try to crack down on the politics as much as possible under his rule. And I think the US policy towards China seems to be shifting to represent that. And I think that you're going to see this in terms of a greater interest in building or rebuilding alliances with other partners in Asia. I think that Trump has been singularly unhelpful in this regard by early on pulling America out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership trade deal, which could have been a big instrument for building closer ties with democratic friends and allies in the region. But I think that there is an opportunity for the U.S. to do that. I think that a certain amount of this is going to be nature taking its course as a lot of American and other foreign companies rethink some of the length of their supply chains and the extent to which that reaches into China in light of long-term problems like intellectual property theft or some of what we learned about supply chain vulnerability after the virus. I mean, if there's going to be any kind of military flashpoint here, I don't see that coming from enthusiasm in the US or elsewhere in the West for some kind of military confrontation. But I do think that there is a real danger in Beijing that Xi Jinping's tendency to draw on nationalist support as part of his domestic political program kind of leads China down a path where you have more potential for making mistakes, and that becomes a much more difficult situation for the US to try to manage.
Thanks, Joe. Nicky.
It's a tough one to sort of looking into the future. I honestly don't know, I think, with regards to this question. I don't think, I don't know. Nice.
I'm happy to jump in.
Matt, you jump in.
Sure. I would, the China relationship has a few facets to it. There's obviously the military strategic side, the economic and trade side, the political system and human rights side of how we from the US or UK would view China's system. If you go back to the spirit and the strategy of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was the Obama era effort to weave together a trading bloc that spanned from the west of South America through to South Asia, basically, and Southeast Asia. The idea was to play to the market share incentive that guides the 5-year plans and the economic regulations that China undertakes. So in the Chinese collectivist leadership system, if I were to summarize, the way that they think about allowing companies in or out or trading with companies really relates to their incentive, as they see it, to maximize their domestic market share by companies owned by Chinese-owned companies. So they will trade access to their market for trade and investment elsewhere in a very bare-knuckled way at times, in a very unpredictable way. So we had a strategy for that. We then abandoned our own strategy and instead went into a tweet war, trade war strategy. And where we've gotten to now is that there is a trade deal, a two-phase trade deal that's agreed by the US and China that provides for, it accounts for some of the tariffs that have been put on both sides, but it also provides for certain certain quantities to be bought of agricultural products, in particular out of the US. So where we are right now with COVID is that we're very unlikely to see those quotas met in the phase 1 of that US-China trade deal in terms of the Chinese purchase of US agricultural products. So we're going to see in 3 or 4 months' time, when both sides are taking inventory on progress against that deal, that the Chinese side will most likely call force majeure, that COVID could not have been prevented and it was outside of their control to not be able to make those agricultural purchases. And the question then is, well, how is Trump going to respond? So very likely we could enter into another tweet war, trade war spiral in a second Trump term. The hope would be that under Joe Biden, you would see something that would be a little bit longer term in its thinking and maybe a little bit more rational, which would mean engagement. To Joseph's point, there is really a consensus on both sides in the U.S. That the U.S. needs to be tough on Chinese theft of IP, military aggression in the South China Sea, human rights in Shenzhen, and the list goes on. But the question is, how do you do it? Do you embarrass your Chinese negotiating counterparts in public? And do you feel good for a moment that you've really got them on Twitter? Or do you actually maintain substantive dialogues for months or even years at a time to try to be persistent, to negotiate your way into better behavior?
It's really interesting because I think that you'd be hard pressed to find, policymakers in Westminster or, Brussels or Berlin for that matter, or Paris who don't actually agree with some of the diagnosis under the Trump administration, read the problems with China. I think, there is a consensus that, economically, morally, and strategically, there is a need to sort of reset relations. But I think that consensus around the diagnosis is often lost in obviously the heated debate around what the responses should be to that. Sarah.
Thanks. Yeah. What I will say about the U.S.-China trade agreement is that it does provide conflict resolution mechanisms for if China does break its terms of the trade agreement. And that was a huge accomplishment to actually get the Chinese to agree to this. And that offers transparency, that also helps us protect our IT and our IP more. And there is consensus, as Matthew said, around the theft of those items from the US. But I think what we're going to see in a Cold War with China is a greater commitment to US manufacturing. We saw and we felt it in especially the early weeks of COVID, the lack of being able to provide PPE to our own healthcare workers, frontline workers. We were able to turn around and produce our own ventilators. But I think America, the mentality in America is not, we need cheap goods, we need cheap products. I hear conversations even around free traders for the first time saying, I'm willing to pay a little more if it's made in America. And I think that is a real mental transition in consumerism in America, that right now it's really about making us competitive on that front. Where we used to be, especially during the World War II era and post-war era. So no longer shipping out or delegating responsibilities for our manufacturing. But I think, of course, we're going to try to avoid military conflict wherever possible. But it will be a race over who has greater financial influence around the world. And, China's well on its way, especially in parts of Africa and Asia.
It's fascinating. I mean, just the continuity with some of the different issues that Britain is facing here. When you talk about China and you think about those issues about supply chains and, I suppose, reinvigorating manufacturing capability and things, these are issues that are very resonant with British voters as well at the moment. Kate.
This is by no means my area of expertise. I guess I would just say a few words from the economic perspective, that I think the role that technology is going to play in heating up between the US and the UK and those tensions is going to be key. Before coronavirus last autumn, Apple was assessing how costly it would be to move a third of its production capacity that's currently in China out of China to diversify in other parts of Asia. And I think there has been a dawning on companies before coronavirus that being so heavily invested in a region that does not respect all sorts of laws in the way that the West does, certainly in terms of how they treat people, but also in terms of IP, as other speakers have talked about, is actually really quite a serious issue, and they're starting to feel vulnerable. So I think from the private sector, you're already seeing this nudge away from China. And I think Sarah's right. It's going to be interesting there's a really fine line between being self-sufficient and being protectionist. And you're going to see a lot of countries starting to walk it. It's completely understandable in the age of COVID, especially as supply chains have been tested. I would note many held up quite well, but as they were tested and as they seem more vulnerable, to say I want to be able to create PPE, enough ventilators, enough hand sanitizer in my own country doesn't seem as protectionist as it would have 6 months ago, but actually quite a sensible thing to do. But no doubt a president like Donald Trump is going to push that into all other areas to promote his own agenda. And I agree as well. I think Matthew was saying that the role that something like TTIP could play in creating almost an economic powerhouse close to China and intentionally excluding China could have quite a serious impact without the need for military intervention.
Well, indeed, we've seen this week, of course, when the Trade Secretary announced the formalization of our trade agreement with Japan, we saw her immediately limp into the CPTPP discussions, which of course is the sort of successor to all of this. I think there is a big hope that there could be a sort of alternative power base economically, which could also bear fruit strategically for interests in that region. So definitely a conversation we'll be continuing to have here in the UK as well. We're all out of time. I think we've tried to answer as many of your questions as possible. I will say there's a few questions in there. I think something that's playing on everybody's mind is that not only does this election feel incredibly significant, but also that the circumstances around it feel so uncertain. I think people are starting to emotionally prepare themselves for this idea that the very process of voting might be rather difficult for some people, and the process of counting and processing those votes, and to the point where we could actually have a clear victory on election night is starting to feel less and less certain. The hypothesis seems to be that it could be days, potentially even stretching into a week until we know the result. There's clearly a lot of interest in that conversation, and I think also it'd be great to pick up in future discussions around some of Nicky's earlier points around social media and what Matthew was saying around the actual infrastructure of the election, because I think clearly that is something that people are going to be wanting to catch up on and learn more about as we go into this very strange historical election, the COVID election. But for now, thank you very much to our audience, and all that's left to do is you will not hear the clapping of the audience, but audience, I would love you to share your appreciation in any way you can for our wonderful panelists, Nicky, Joe, Matt, Sarah, and Kate. Thank you very much for your time. I know you're all extraordinarily busy, and we hope to check in with you again later down the line as we approach the election and in its aftermath as well. So thank you very much from the British Foreign Policy Group.